Has New Zealand lost its way? And if so, what needs to be done to get back on track? Joining me to discuss is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, historian, self-described intellectual mongrel, Mike Grimshaw. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Darcy. Thanks for having me on.
Cool. I'm glad that you describe yourself as an intellectual mongrel, but what do you mean by that?
Basically, a mongrel in the sense that I look at everything. One of the joys of being a sociologist is that everything, because we talk about society and people, we look at everything, and an intellectual mongrel means that nothing is outside of sort of mixing and matching and trying to make sense of it.
That's good.
I'm not really a great fan of purity. I think it's the impurity that makes things interesting and where things rub up against each other and having to look at things in different ways and being open to different things. I think universities are often too pure in their thinking, and it's what you leave out that becomes the problem rather than what you include.
Okay. In your view, if we were to get to the root of the problem as to what might be holding New Zealanders back, like if we really have lost our way, then we kind of want to figure out, well, how do we get to where we
Yeah.
were to begin with, right? How do we find our way back to where we were before? Sounds like a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song, right? But yeah, let's start there. Has New Zealand lost its way, though?
I think most people would agree that there's something that we've lost. We're not where we think we should be. We're not where we thought we would be. And there's been a lot of discussion about when that occurred, and it seems to be around about 73 when Britain entered the European Union. New Zealand lost its singular market. It didn't really have a plan to transition into a new future. And then we got the oil shocks, which hit us really hard. And that combination of oil shocks and agricultural reduction of our singular market meant we had to try and work out exactly what we were going to be and how we were going to be as a small, isolated nation down the end of the world that based itself primarily on agriculture, and in a world that was becoming post-industrial when we were just trying to become industrial. And so we've been playing catch up ever since. We're not really where we should be. There's a famous book that came out in 1992 called New Zealand, an Undeveloping Nation, which looked back over the past 20 years and said, well, we haven't really been developing for the last 20 years, a book by David McLaughlin. And I gave the introduction of that to my third year social policy class, social history class this year, and said, well, where are we now, 2025? And they were shocked because they saw that we hadn't even developed really from 1992. In many ways, we're stuck. We're sort of stuck in second gear. We're not really getting forward. And then if you think out of that, well, we're going back to 1973. We've really been sort of stalled without real progress for about 50 years. I mean, there's been some elements where we've progressed, some elements of culture, some elements of society, but overall, we haven't really developed in the way that other nations have over that past 50 years. And I think that's the concern for all of us.
Yeah. In 1950, and I was researching this before we started, in 1950, New Zealand was the third, I think, in the OECD for GDP per capita. And I think now we're 38th or something like that. And
Yeah.
so there was 35 other people that got ahead of us, perhaps, or we slipped back. I'm not quite sure, but like starting around the 1950s, just to describe what that was like in New Zealand, you kind of already gave a few hints to that. But right after World War II, New Zealand was effectively becoming wealthy off the back of selling wool. Would that be a fair call?
Yeah. Back in World War II, we hadn't been damaged by World War II in a physical sense. We also had a guaranteed market for all our agricultural produce into Britain. And then there was the Korean War, and the Americans bought up our wool. And wool was the thing that drove our economic prosperity in those post-war years. The trouble is that wool markets started to fall apart even in the 1960s. And so there were concerns about what our wool future would be in the 1960s. Then, as I said, in 1973, Britain entered the common market. So we have declined, and other countries have progressed. And I think it's both of those things that have happened.
Sure.
We haven't really got going. They have got going in a much more accelerated and well-rounded way than New Zealand. And we're not quite sure what to do. And I think that's one of the problems, that we keep on coming back to the sense there's something to do, we're not sure what to do, but economically we have really not taken off as we should. And then I think the other big thing that really hit us was the 87 share market crash. And everyone forgets the impact of that 87 share market crash, which then, by the time it really hit New Zealand in 89, caused widespread sort of socio-economic damage. But the longest term impact, I would argue, is actually that of the housing market, because middle New Zealand took its money out of shares. And prior to the 87 share market crash, there was that huge investment, that opening up into the share market of middle New Zealand. And when they lost their money, they lost their confidence in the share market. And so housing became the basis of the New Zealand economy. And you can't really run a developing first world economy just on housing. And it's often been described that New Zealand's a housing market with an economy attached. And I think that's one of the great problems that we've got, because we don't have that sense of investment into things that are not housing or housing related in this country. And there's only, 5 million people of us in the country. And this is the other issue, that how we grow an economy, because as I say to my students, if you want a welfare state, you've got to pay for it. And that needs a strong economy. And so if we're going to talk about wealth, we need to talk about social wealth, we need to talk about cultural wealth, and those things are all related to a wealthy welfare state, I would argue. And how we come about to refit that is one of those big questions of the 21st century. I mean, is a 20th century model of a welfare state workable in the 21st century? What do we need to fund it? How do we fund it? What do we use it for? How do we use it? But that underlying sense of investment in New Zealand, investment in people, investment in ideas, investment in hope, I would argue, is probably the most important thing.
Yeah. Is this the same reason that the other countries got ahead and New Zealand fell behind, like missed opportunities, just not getting the act together and getting clear on what a vision was way back in the 60s? Is that still the psyche that's present? And is that the reason why we kind of have lost our way?
I think we lurch from crisis to crisis. I think we're very suspicious of ideas in this country. We're not very good at thinking, we're good at reacting. And I think the other thing that is problematic is that great sort of New Zealand sense of DIY. Okay, we'll do it ourselves, we'll cobble it together. And that's not really a way to run an economy. It's not really a way to run a country. It's not really a way to think about progress, whether it's economic, it's social, it's cultural, or even environmental. And so it's very piecemeal. And I think that's one of the problems. We're not very good at joined up thinking in this country. We tend to see things in isolation. And we're not very good at planning. Back in the 70s, there was the Commission for the Future. And that was meant to set out what we were thinking about the future and what the possibilities were. But we disbanded that. We've had the New Zealand Planning Council, which had a lot of reports about what should happen. And again, we tend to ignore that. We've had the Productivity Commission, which failed to lift productivity, but then how are we trying to enact and enable productivity, and how do we measure productivity in this country? And I think also a 3-year election cycle is a real problem, because it doesn't give us enough time to embed changes that might need to happen. We tend to be very short-sighted. We tend to be very dissatisfied in any attempts to do long-term thinking in this country, or cross-party planning. And so all of these sorts of things mean that we tend to lurch around, but in many ways we don't really progress. We tend to just sort of vary where we are. And the other trouble is that when we have a situation like this, the areas that do progress tend to be quite unconnected to those areas that don't progress. So we get increased inequality, we get increased social inequality, economic inequality, and then nothing ever happens in a considered, engaged, thought through fashion. And I think this is part of the New Zealand response as well. We are not very good at planning. We like to have meetings, but we're not very good at doing anything positive out of the meeting. And the outcome of a meeting is another meeting, is another meeting, is another meeting. But to make a decision becomes a problematic option for New Zealand, because we're not really sure what it is we want to decide, or if we do decide, we're not very good at including those who might disagree with us to bring them on board. And so it becomes quite oppositional as well.
And is that like, I would just assume, well, if other parts of the world they seem to be better at doing some of these things, then well, surely some of those people are living in New Zealand, right? Like why haven't they risen to the top to influence, to create policy, to create action? Why aren't those types of people, like what is it about this physical location of New Zealand? Is there something in the water?
I think it's actually when we were settled and what we came here to do. And we settled in many, we came here primarily for an individual outcome. And that is one of the ongoing issues, I think. We were scattered small communities. We were quite atomized in the sense that we were highly individualized. Miles Fairbairn, the historian, has written an interesting book about this, The Ideal Society and Its Enemies, how we were quite isolated and isolated as individuals. And this means that it's difficult to get long-term social cohesion, and we were always an extractive economy. And so we were always based on sending things overseas, which makes us very dependent on a world market, makes us very dependent on supply routes, it makes us very dependent on what is happening overseas as to what we can do here.
Hmm.
And we weren't very good at, in many ways, investing back into the country. And so that's one thing that is sitting there. But also the other question is, well, what is the point of New Zealand? That was always one of those questions. If we had to say, well, what is it that New Zealand stands for? Well, we might talk about egalitarianism, we might talk about giving people a fair go, but in many ways there's always that limit, as people talk about the tall poppy syndrome, that we, as long as you do things within the expected, you are okay, which is very much like a small village. And I think that's one of the things. We are like a small village in our thinking still. And even this plays in even as we've become very urban. I mean, one of the strange things about New Zealand is that we have been an urban society for over 120 years. But in our heads, we think of ourselves as a rural society. But we're not. We're highly urbanized. What I'd say is we're not rural, we are rural adjacent. And so we don't really like living in cities. We don't like being urban. And so we don't do urban living very well either. And that we can see that in the way that we live. I always think it's also very telling that the term suburban neuroses developed in New Zealand. It was a New Zealand psychiatrist who actually came up with that term to describe the effects of a type of suburban living that sort of wore people down and disturbed them mentally as well as physically. And in other words, we don't do urban living very well. And if you think about how our cities are, how our towns are compared to other countries, we tend to live against each other rather than live with each other. And I think those things also flow through into the wider society as a whole. And so there's been the big report out of the Helen Clark Foundation just the other day on the collapse of social cohesion in New Zealand. But I'm not really surprised. I think we've lacked social cohesion for a long time. We've just been quite good at not looking at or looking for social cohesion, or assuming it is far greater than it is. We suffer at almost what you'd call nationally a type of short man's disease in that way. We sort of over-egg ourselves, sort of like a little bantam, and think we're much bigger and better than we are. So probably a cold hard dose of realism might be needed.
Okay. That's interesting. A good way to put it. And I'm glad you brought up that term social cohesion on one of your posts on LinkedIn recently that caught my attention. I think you said the problem is we need bottom up social cohesion. It can't be a demand or a command from the top down. Can
Yep.
you then like walk us through how you would navigate this social cohesion thing? Like in practice, if it's not from like a command and control dictate, where does this social cohesion come from? How can you create it?
Well, I think it's that notion of a social contract. And social contract occurs two ways. One is top down, or between the individual and the state. The other one that's more important, I'd argue, is that one that's horizontal,
Yeah.
and that's between individuals.
Hmm.
And so social cohesion to work means that we need to restore notions of community. We need to work on how our neighbourhoods work, how our institutions work, how our living spaces as towns and cities work.
Mm.
How do our workplaces work? I mean, the the demand in New Zealand to work from home doesn't really work with social cohesion. I think there's an issue there. We find other people problematic in this country in many ways. To have social cohesion, you've got to have common values or a sense of commonality. And I always say that society is made up of people not like me. They might not like me. I might not like them. We might not agree, but we've got to live and get on with each other and got to find some things in common. Now we can go back to community. And so community is good, but remember also we talk about gated communities, communities that have boundaries around them. And it's how we break down those boundaries between various communities so they can see what they hold in common. So it's not just a series of competing communities. And when you've only got competing communities, that's when you lack social cohesion. But then you've got to have a narrative, you've got to have an idea, you've got to have a sense of purpose that takes you out of just your immediate identity, whether it's that you as an individual, whether it's just you with your family of whānau, whether it's just you in your community of interest. And that's one of the great problems, I think, for New Zealand, to have a sense of what is it that we hold in common, what might provide a common social or moral order, a sense of purpose, a sense of communal values, a sense of communal identity that actually we can have as the basis for society. And we're not very good at talking about these things either. I mean, one of the great things about New Zealand is the way that we're not very good about talking about ideas or feelings often until people go and have far too many drinks at the pub or something like that, and then they start to have those sort of questions. Most of the time we try to keep things on the superficial. And so to start to build social cohesion, you've got to have a sense of, okay, what do we hold in common that we think is important, not just for me and not just for those I like, but what is important for those who are not like me, and what can we find in common, and what can we aspire towards? And I think that's the great thing. What is it that we think we can aspire towards that is going to take people with us rather than divide us off against each other?
So I think, yeah, especially in the last 5 years in particular, the sense of divisiveness has picked up considerably. Like in, I think most households, there'll be cases of people acting more of a certain way, which then triggers in the other person a reaction of the opposite side of that. And so you have this divisiveness going on within households and within the community. Going back to what you were saying, it's kind of like we don't really like people. We don't like other people. And I think I know what you mean by that. And I think especially the ones that are different to us are the
Yep.
worst, right? And it's unfortunate because we're getting more and more different people coming onto our shores, and we're also importing more and more different ideas. So going back to the social cohesion word, that really got my attention when I was going through this before. And so I did a bit of Googling. I discovered the Helen Clark Foundation. I discovered that report and the people that were involved in it, and discovered that it wasn't a new concept, social cohesion. But then I kind of considered maybe there could be ways that could be used to silence those that are causing the division or apparently causing those division. And it just so happens to be that those that are more likely to cause the division that initiatives like that don't like are those probably center of right. Correct me if I'm going down a wrong path here, but it just kind of feels interesting that those that are more likely to create jobs in the economy are probably those that hold the views that are those that are likely to be silenced by those seeking to get the social cohesion from a top-down perspective. Um, am I going down the right path there, or do you think I'm
Yeah,
slightly misinformed?
no, I think you're pointing out something quite important, and I always say that New Zealand's suffering long COVID. We're suffering long COVID socially, economically, and culturally, and interpersonally, and that's because we went into COVID in not a good space, and we demanded social cohesion rather than facilitated it, and then we also have lost trust in the media. And I think the mainstream media is actually really important because mainstream media is that which traditionally has held a nation together. It's informed you that there are other people who are in other places that you've got something in common with. And when you collapse and when you end mainstream media, as New Zealand has done in a very radical way compared to most other countries.
Yeah.
We lose that commonality. Benedict Anderson, the historian and sociologist, wrote a really important book called Imagined Communities, and that was about the rise of nationalism, the rise of the nation state, and he talked there about the central role of the mainstream media, the central role of the newspaper. That gave you a sense that there were other people who occupied this thing called the nation, that you had things in common with. You didn't have to agree with them, but you were sharing things in common. And I think one of the problems in New Zealand has been that collapse of the mainstream media, especially after COVID. But we also embrace social media in a way that is deeply problematic, because I think when you're on social media, you're often not engaging with the people around you. Yeah. You're ignoring where they are. So then to get back to your point about politics left and right, and I think this is where I think the question of free speech becomes really important, because free speech used to be primarily from the left in New Zealand. The demand for free speech was from the left against what was seen as a conservative, constrictive mainstream right. The Civil Liberties Union in New Zealand started in the early 1950s as a response to the waterfront dispute and the attempts of the government to limit what was happening there. And so what has happened, however, is that now we've seen the switch to where those who are demanding or are arguing for free speech tend to be now more centre-right, against the constraints of what is seen as the centre-left or the left wing. And I think I've always said that both sides are problematic in New Zealand, and that people want free speech for them, but not free speech for other people.
Yeah.
And you've got to have free speech in association with free thinking. And what we're not very good at in New Zealand is free thinking. And so we're not very happy that people might think in different ways. And we see this on both sides of the political spectrum. So then if we think about cohesion, well, it's much easier to have social cohesion if you feel the economy is going well. And I think that's something that we tend to forget, because in the end, I mean, James Carville was right. I mean, the great American spin doctor for Clinton, what did he say? It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
And I think if you want social cohesion, the first thing is, okay, get the economy right, and then it's what you do with the economy. And so get the economy right, and then how do you use the economy to enable social cohesion? At the moment, the economy is not right, and because there is inequality, because people feel that they're economically suffering, they also then feel that they are socially and culturally suffering as well. And so again, it's that bringing together. Rather than seeing business as a problem, I see business as part of the fabric of the state, because if you want to have a modern welfare state, you've got to pay for it. You've got to have economic success, and then you can use the economy in ways that actually build social cohesion. Because trying to build social cohesion without an economic basis, I think, is, well, you actually can't do that. And that's one thing that we're finding. So economic constriction creates a lack of social cohesion, because then people don't feel invested in the country. They don't feel invested in the same way as well. Yeah. And so that would put me probably at odds with many in the university who tend to often would say that business is a problem. I think business is necessary. It's how we do business and how we then use what we gain from business to build social cohesion, to underwrite social cohesion, and to underwrite a sense of inclusion, realizing that we're never going to get it right. And I think that's the other thing. We're never going to achieve a utopia, but we can have a sense of opening up opportunity. And that was one of the things of the first Labour government, that in their manifesto they talked about the opening up of opportunity. And that was also for business, that was for farming, that was for science, it was for a whole lot of things. And I think that's what social cohesion is, the opening up of opportunity. And I think that's really what we feel we've lost. I mean, for the last 15 years, I've talked to young people and said, do you see a future for yourself in New Zealand? Do you see a future for yourself here in the next 10 years? 90% of them say no. Now, I think that's really problematic. And that's going back 15 or so years. But that is also across a variety of backgrounds. That's even talking to the young kids who are coming in from school for the open days. And so these were kids still at school who felt there was not much hope for them in this country. And so this goes back before COVID. This goes back in time. And I think that is the great problem that we've actually got, that there's many of our young people have felt for a long time there's not really much hope for them in this country, or not really much point for them to stay. And I think that's a real problem for a country when it's exporting too many of its young people, because you're not getting a return on your social investment, your educational investment, but also your societal investment as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
It's
thank you.
probably too large an answer for a simple question, but
It's not
I
a
think we've
simple
got to put it
question.
in those wider contexts.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And that's where I guess someone like yourself, being an intellectual mongrel, really helps to kind of see that, right? And I know it's tempting, I guess, no matter what view you want to adopt, it's tempting just to pick one side of that view because there's lots of friends there. But it
Mm.
must be lonely kind of having these views that probably give you a bit of cognitive dissonance. But I think it's really important because it's probably part of bringing people together to be able to talk freely, because without talking freely and thinking freely, you're not going to, it's a cycle, right? So going back to what you're saying though around the loss of trust, I guess, in mainstream media, it would be really important to have some sort of town square concept within New Zealand. That would be great. I could see how that would cause people to come together and discourse and do that sort of thing. And with social media, that makes it hard. But why do you think we've lost trust in, say, government and trust in mainstream media? Obviously, this is a worldwide thing, but specifically in New Zealand with this, how do you see that, or I guess what would you blame as the source of that distrust?
A lack of outcomes. I mean, and again, I'd say this lack of outcomes goes back to that transition point in '73. I mean, we've been struggling in different ways from '73 onwards, and the country was divided back in the '70s. This is what we forget. It was a divided country. The '81 Springbok tour, that wasn't just about sport. That was about everything. That was about what type of country we wanted to live in, who had the power, who had the influence. Was it an old New Zealand? Was it an emerging New Zealand? Was it a rural dominated New Zealand? Was it a more urban New Zealand? Was it a farming dominated, or was it a more urban skills infrastructure dominated New Zealand? Was it just a Pākehā dominated New Zealand? Was it a male? All of those things came together. And I think that's why '81 was such a flashpoint, because it was the build up of about 10 years of tension. And I think in many ways, '81 gave the impetus for those changes in '84 onwards, which was about agency. And I think we've got to remember that many of those changes that came in '84, which included parts of our society to be able to participate in ways that before '84 they were not able to. And I think agency is something that is both on the left and the right. I mean, people forget that Foucault was interested in agency because the French thinker, because he read Hayek's Why I'm Not a Conservative. He didn't want to be a conservative, and he thought, well, and Marxism wasn't working, and so how do we get this notion of agency? And so we're getting these two different strands coming through. So that's one side of it. Then we come to think about trust in government. And the trust in government is, well, has government delivered on its promises? Has government delivered on what it says it's going to? And more so, does government deliver for not just those people, but for me as well? And I think this is one of the questions that we keep on struggling with, that who is seen to benefit from what government is seeking to do? But secondly, am I being listened to? The third thing was, this is why we had MMP. I mean, MMP came in with the sense that it would not only increase participation, but it would increase the inclusion of outcome, because you would be there and you would be seen as part of the decision making, and for your interests and your identity would be in some way socially, culturally, economically included. But MMP hasn't really changed much. And I think this is the thing. We haven't seen that economic or social expansion in the way that we thought MMP might. And so and the sense that, well, coalitions are stitched up beforehand, or that our government lacks caution. And I think there are things that the lack of hope when governments say they're going to do something, or the potential for doing something, and then they pull back.
Mm.
So the feeling is that, well, government is not actually going to answer the questions that I've got. At the same time, we become far more open to a divergence of ideas from around the world because of social media. And also the collapse of the mainstream media is because people did not see themselves represented in the media, in the discussion of the media, in the way that media was framing the situation of the country. It became a demand that you were this or you were a bad person. And I think that's never a way to operate, because we also didn't have that variety of perspectives that enable people to find themselves in how they were being talked about or discussed in the media in that way. Slovenian philosopher Zizek talked about, well, what caused the change in Eastern Europe was people waiting for the buses to come that never came. And so they're standing there having a cigarette, waiting for the buses to come, looking around and seeing the broken windows, seeing the roads that weren't working, seeing what wasn't happening. And that was what caused, he said, in many ways, that drive for change in Eastern Europe, that awareness that what you were being told and what you were actually seeing didn't match up. And I think in many ways that's something that New Zealand has had over the last 20 odd years or longer. What we were told was occurring and what the lived experience was for many people just didn't relate.
Mm.
And so that sense of dissatisfaction, but it was very hard to articulate exactly why that dissatisfaction, because we're often told this is the greatest country in the world, or what a wonderful place to raise children, until you think about, well, child hunger, you think about child violence, all those sorts of things, educational issues. Well, it's a wonderful, clean, green country. Oh no, but you can't drink the water, you can't go for a swim there, you can't access that. Well, yes, it's a great country to live. Oh, but housing is really expensive, and what we do have is not very good, and trying to get around. All of those sorts of things that we're told one thing, but actually the lived experience of the other is actually what causes the dissatisfactions. So we weren't delivering on what we were told was the situation we found ourselves in. And there's only a while you can continue that. I mean, it's like with kids. You can only tell your kids so many things before they start asking why. If you don't answer the why, then they keep on asking the why, and you've got to talk with them and also not talk at your kids at the same time. You've got to facilitate those questions and expand their understanding. But we weren't very good at facilitating the questions that the population were asking in that way. And I don't think the media did a good job for that. I don't think the universities did a good job of that. I don't think politicians did a good job of that. And so when people felt that they were not being heard, or they were being dismissed, or you shouldn't ask that question, or that's not really important, that's when that sense of, well, we'll just withdraw. Yeah. And we lost that trust. And I think a lack of social cohesion is actually a loss of trust. And that's the really interesting thing. If we talked about the collapse of trust in New Zealand and the collapse of hope, then we might actually take the collapse of social cohesion far more seriously.
That's great. Thank you. Neoliberalism, it's a hard word to say sometimes, but it's an important concept to get. And I think there's a trend that's occurring within that probably needs to be overlaid here, because that's again, it's not a New Zealand thing there. Can you just quickly discuss or quickly define what neoliberalism means, and then comment on whether or not we are indeed witnessing the decline of it, and is it faster or slower here in New Zealand?
The New Zealand way we talked about it was actually more market. It was seen as the more market framework. One of the interesting people who did a lot of work on this back in the 70s, early 80s, as an MP was a guy called Ian McLean, who was actually an agricultural economist. And he did some interesting work on more market within the agricultural sector, but more widely. And it's about opening up the state and the individuals to competition, and against the traditional forces of conservatism. And it's seen as the market will regulate in a way that the state can't, but also give you not only economic freedom, but theoretically social freedom and individual freedom, and therefore this notion of agency. Now, New Zealand went neoliberal in 84, but it was starting to go neoliberal from the early 80s onwards, from the late 70s onwards, as a start of a thinking, well, because the centralised economy under Muldoon, which was very highly regulated, was seen to not be working, they needed to open up New Zealand to a new way of being and living in that way. In many ways, that's why Hayek's Why I'm Not a Conservative is actually an important pamphlet to read, because it helps us understand what the appeal of neoliberalism actually was. And on one level, it's about choice. It's about agency. And so one side of neoliberalism is actually identity politics. That's what we forget. This notion that I have the choice to be who I wish to be. I have the choice to be, to think about myself as an individual, not just as a collective. And so you get the new left neoliberalism as well as the new right neoliberalism come together. Mm. What that did do was open up New Zealand at a time when we were feeling quite highly constricted. And so what it was seen as offering for New Zealand was choices for those who seemed to lack choice. This is what we forget. This is why it came in, I would argue, from the Labour government at that time, because Douglas and co were actually wanting to give more choice to those who they felt were lacking choice in the current welfare system of New Zealand and the current economic system of New Zealand. It was meant to open up inclusion. And so that was that sense that, well, the state as it was not delivering for New Zealanders. The welfare system at the moment was trapping people, not facilitating people, not trusting that people could make their own decisions, but the sense that decisions had to be made for you. And that choice was going to be limited rather than choice was going to be open, and you were actually expected but also understood to be able to make choices. Now, in many ways, that happened really quickly. And I think that's part of the problem, that if you could have brought it in a more slow, gradual, holistic fashion, rather than, in a sense, the shock that came in because of how Muldoon had tanked the New Zealand economy, that it became a sort of an emergency procedure in New Zealand. And I think we're not very good at dealing with shocks. That nobody's very good at dealing with shocks that happen really quickly. But then we weren't sure how to actually enact it. And so we did it very fast. And I think that also is what caused the problem. Now, what it means is that we also then Longy had his cup of tea, where he paused for various reasons. And I would argue that caught us in the worst of both worlds. So we were never fully one thing nor the other, but we weren't actually sure why we were where we were. But what that's also meant is that we have become sort of, everybody's neoliberal. I mean, I'm the last generation who can remember life before neoliberalism, and I'm 58. I mean, we're old, those who can remember life beforehand. And New Zealand wasn't a great place. It was quite limited. It was very limited socially. It was very limited in terms of choice and agency. Its attitudes were very conservative and constricted back then. And so we've also got to think that the agency of neoliberalism is one reason why we've had we've got the Waitangi Tribunal and its attempt to give agency back to Maori. With the increases in agency for women, for gays, lesbians, minorities are all part of that agency question. It's just economically we haven't been able to do an economic neoliberalism that is able to expand the outcomes to as many people as we would probably wish and hope that there could be. And so you get the capture of the economic outcomes not being spread as it should, ideally, in a welfare state. And so what we have is a neoliberal welfare state and a neoliberal New Zealand that has been neoliberal as a welfare state, as forms of government, no matter who is in government from 84 onwards. It doesn't matter whether it's a Labour-led coalition or a national-led coalition, Labour government or a national government. They are different forms of neoliberalism because the outside to neoliberalism is difficult to comprehend. I mean, can you rethink a form of collectivism? Well, how would people vote for collectivism if it was also therefore a constriction upon agency? Once people have choice, it's very hard to say to people, we're going to take choice away from you. And so when people say, well, is it the end of neoliberalism? Well, we could argue that Trumpism is a type of economic nationalism, which is an anti-neoliberalism. Now, the question is, do we want to go down that line? Is that the type of society we wish to live in? And so we're not very good at thinking economically in this country. We're also not very good at thinking politically. But that's also because we're not very good at talking about these things. We're very good at talking at others about this, but not very good at talking with others. And I think, again, that comes back to we're not very good at living with people. We're very good at living against other people. And so, again, if we want to move into a new way of being economically, we've got to be able to talk about that, not just shout at each other or not just ignore each other or say, that's wrong just because I don't, you're over there, and automatically I'm in a antagonistic or confrontational position with you just because, well, that's who you are for me. And I think that's one of our big problems we've got.
Yeah. And considering where New Zealand is at today, I'm kind of just thinking, well, it's only up from here. We can get much better
Yep.
from here. And so I then go, well, to me, that kind of feels like an opportunity, because whenever you're solving for a big problem, and I would just say, hey, just because we're talking about something in the social context as well as the economic context doesn't mean we need to limit this to just a conversation about dollars. However, in this case, I think sometimes real wealth, especially when we expand the definition of what wealth really is found when we solve problems. And we're going to solve problems when we see reality for what it is, not what we're trying to force it to be because of some ism that we've adopted. But when we see reality for what it really is accurately, then maybe we can stumble across opportunities to create wealth out of it. So, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to do by having this conversation with you. So, what are some of the ways, or what are some of the other practical ways that you can think of that we can suggest to help everyday people find their way in this new world that we're in, right? Like, how can we help New Zealand find its way if it is lost?
One of the big questions is, okay, what do we want to be?
Sure.
And that's more than just in a general sense. How do we wish to live as a society? But also, what do we think our values as a society are, or what can we start to articulate? The second thing is, okay, the wealth of a country actually resides not in its resources. It resides in what you do with them. And the biggest resource of any country is actually brains.
Yeah.
And so one of the big problems we've got is our education system as it currently is. And we don't make the best use of it. We see education as something to be endured rather than something that is facilitating the economic and personal and individual and cultural and social growth of a country. I mean, I'm in the university system. We graduate, I think, about 43,000 students a year in the New Zealand tertiary system. 90% of those will be at an undergraduate level, if not more. Are we creating 43,000 jobs a year in New Zealand that require a tertiary education? And that's a problematic question.
Yeah.
Now, we could say, well, there's a social and cultural value of education. Now, I would argue that, but I don't think we're doing it right, because if we are doing that right, then over the last 15, 20 odd years, 25 years, where we've seen this great increase in numbers coming into tertiary education, we would see an associated increase socially and culturally in New Zealand that we could see as social and cultural growth, but also economic growth in the same way. Now, we're not seeing it in that way, and I think that is one of the problems. But then universities can only deal with who is coming in, and so what's coming in down the pipeline? We know the most important investment you can make is in the first 3 to 5 years of someone's life. In many ways, most of your choices and options are determined by what happens to you in those first 3 to 5 years. Are we investing properly in our preschool? Are we investing properly in our young people? Are we giving them the best chance, the best hope, the best home conditions, those sorts of things, which is therefore a long-term investment, but we don't tend to see it in that way because those people don't vote. And so there's not the same sense that we can build on that. The second thing is then what are we doing in our schools to encourage participation that is not just endurance? Now, I'm not believing that everyone goes to school and thinks it's wonderful. Of course they're not. But are we actually making it meaningful? And I think one of the big problems in New Zealand is we believe examinations are going to answer everything. And I think that's a problem. The first tertiary commission in New Zealand back in about 1911 was saying over 100 years ago, too much of a focus on examinations in New Zealand and not enough on education. And we tend to think, well, we'll examine rather than actually facilitate the type of thinking, the type of learning, the type of cohesiveness that actually might be a good thing for New Zealand as a whole. So I think it starts with education, and I'd include all areas of education in that. But we've also got to see education as important. And for a long time, we didn't see education as important because you could leave school at 15 and get a job without any skills or qualification, without any qualifications. And yet we know now that a 3-year undergraduate degree in most areas, not just arts, I'd say in science, a lot of areas, will get you what UE got you 30 years ago. The difference is you are paying for your education, but are you getting a return on your investment today? And I don't think in many ways we are, because we're not also growing the economy and the opportunities that actually say, well, we can make use of these skills, this knowledge of the young people to grow the economy, to grow the society, to grow the culture. Mm. And I think that's one of the problems. How do we integrate education far more into societal, economic, cultural wealth creation, I would say, in that way, to make it expansive in that way. So it starts with education. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, okay, we really expect to continue to be a 21st century first world nation primarily on agriculture and tourism? If we do, then we're an international freak in that way, because you've actually got to have more than just agriculture and tourism, especially in a country which is so highly urban. And that's the other thing. So if we are an urban society, which we have been for 120 years, what does a successful urban-based economy look like? And that is the second thing that we're not very good at. I mean, we don't really have a successful urban-based economy in New Zealand. We have a rural-based economy or a rural adjacent-based economy. And so what would an urban-based economy look like, given our isolation from the rest of the world? But this is where new media technology means we can access the world in different ways. The tyranny of distance is supply chains and getting physical goods somewhere. But with the internet, the tyranny of distance is not what it used to be. I mean, you're in Auckland, I'm in Christchurch. Before the internet, we'd be trying to talk down the phone to each other. Yeah. We wouldn't be able to do a podcast.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the same. Yeah.
So how do we actually make use of the technologies as possibility? And so we've got to say, right, we've got this urban population. We've got to have an urban skills technology-based economy, because otherwise we're too dependent upon supply chains. We're too dependent on bringing people here, or too dependent on exporting physical goods somewhere else, which, as we found over COVID, makes us very vulnerable. We've got to consider the risks, but then think about, well, what are the possibilities? And I think that's where education and urban skills-based economy, making use of technology, plus playing on the notion at the same time, New Zealand is seen as something different and exotic. And I think that's something we've got a brand, but we're not very good at actioning it in new ways. We're quite good at keeping it going in the same old ways. And so what would it mean to think about New Zealand as a 21st century society, not as the last society of the 20th century? I mean, I talk about that because I'm in Christchurch and we were meant to be rebuilding the city after the quakes, and the whole plan was this would be the first city of the 21st century. That's what we would build. But as we know, we failed in that, and we built the last city of the 20th century. And I think as a society, New Zealand is still in many ways living in the 20th century. I think economically and in the way that we operate, we're still stuck in that last decade, early decade of the 21st century. We're not really living in 2025. We have to play catch up in that way. But in many ways, we're still stuck with the legacy of 73. And so being aware of our history means we can make sense of where we are. And I think this is where we need probably think tanks. We're not very good at thinking. We're very good at shouting, and we're very good at being silent. But we're not very good at thinking together. And I think that's where we need a variety of different types of think tanks to put possibilities out there as well.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Which is in many ways what you're doing with your podcast, Darcy. You're an unofficial think tank in its own way.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, it feels sometimes like there's nothing left in the tank after a while, right? But there's plenty more other people that can think in this space as well. But no, just thinking about that through, like, education makes a lot of sense, right? Especially what are we teaching kids at an early age in the family? Like, do we value the family to start with, and the role of the parents in that family? Do we respect that? What are we actually teaching the kids in school, both good and bad? Because there's only so much time you can fit in a day, and what are you going to jam it with? And then later on, I guess, how are we preparing people in university for the jobs that actually exist for the type of country that we want to be in? And then technology is a really fascinating one for me as well, right? Because I think that when you're building anything out of nothing, or I guess if you're just innovating, like Joseph Schumpeter, the process of creative destruction, something new displaces something old, and there's a certain sense of mourning over seeing something old go away, but it kind of has to happen, and it's collateral damage maybe, or it's just a cost of bringing something new into existence. And I think about this in the context of financial services, especially bringing something new to the table is going to be very disruptive. And I think in the area of building new wealth for the new world, it will involve looking at new tools, new paradigms, and new ways of framing the future. So this is why I think it's just so important to talk about things like this, because if we're building wealth for that new world, what does that actually look like? Is that going to be a world that you're going to have a home in? And do you even know what it looks like? Because if so, what are the assets that you should hold for that world? And again, I'm thinking quite holistically. But yeah, there's a lot to this, right? And
Yeah, I like your use of Schumpeter. I mean, I teach a stage 1 course on global society, and the theme that runs through that is Schumpeter and creative destruction.
Right.
So how do we understand what is happening in the world? If we find ourselves in a system within capitalism, there's no viable outside to capitalism, I would argue, at the moment. This is where we find ourselves. Why has capitalism continued as it does? Because of creative destruction. This is what globalization does. And global society has positives and negatives, and it's how we moderate between the two of them. So my sociology students come out knowing about Schumpeter in a way that sometimes I find economics students don't know about them, or business students don't know about Schumpeter, which always concerns me, that somehow I'm doing something far more subversive over here in sociology than might be happening in the business school, or that lawyers don't know about Schumpeter and creative destruction, or aren't thinking about that. And I think the other thing is that what we lack is that general education in this country. And I think this notion that we specialise far too young, we specialise far too early, means that we lack that holistic, or we lack the possibility of holistic thinking, that a more general education that is more inclusive of various ways of thought and knowledge, but also gives you a bigger frame to live within, and that you have to encounter different ideas. And I think the failure of a general education system in New Zealand, we're seeing that come home, because even those, the way that our NCEA, everybody knows NCEA is not working. If you've got a child who's gone through NCEA and they're asking those questions, you're trying to help them. I've got a PhD in history, and my daughter who's doing history and trying the NCEA year 11, I'm thinking, none of this makes any sense to me when I'm trying to answer that. And I meant to know this sort of stuff. How do you answer that? Well, what are you looking for?
Yeah.
But I think NCEA is not delivering what it should.
Right.
But I also think that notion that everybody specialises too early in New Zealand, and those who are the beneficiaries of a tertiary education have tended to specialise too early, and they don't know enough. And I think that's where the intellectual mongrel, I think, is actually important. Or as Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, said, the hedgehog who knows a lot about a little thing, or the fox who knows a lot about a lot of things. Well, we don't even have many hedgehogs in New Zealand.
Right.
I mean, our hedgehogs tend to get run over on the road because they're tall poppies, so we just squash them. But we don't really want the foxes out there either, because we don't really want to have to deal with thinking across and knowing a whole lot of things that happen as well.
Sure.
And so I think that's the other thing, to get that breadth of, get some context.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the internet opened us up to the world, but social media has closed us down again. And I'd make a distinction between the internet and social media, because the internet opened New Zealand up and enabled us to engage with and access information.
Yeah.
What social media gives us is primarily just argument.
Yeah.
And I think because your analytics just feed you in the same things. It's what Gillian Tett, the anthropologist who works for the Financial Times, called the silo effect. We increasingly just get siloed. And I think that's another problem of New Zealand, that we are increasingly siloed into these little micro communities. And the people we're siloed with are often not even the people around us.
Yeah.
We're siloed at a distance to those around us. And again, that's that question of social cohesion, but also we don't know enough.
Yeah.
We're not open enough. We want to know what not to think, not to be challenged to think in different ways.
That's totally right. Yeah, that's 100%. Complex systems require complex thought processes, and
Yep.
that takes time. But I still think there's a reward there. So thank you for agreeing to talk with me. Is there some place that you can direct people to go to see more of your output, like the free publicly available output that you do without having to go to
Yeah,
university?
I would say, LinkedIn. I try to do a practice on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
When I talk about practice, I do some teaching into the art school here, some supervision, and in their painting and their graphic design or whatever, they talk about their practice, which is how you engage in your artistic practice, and you make it part of your daily life in that way and engage. And I thought, well, that's what I need to do sociologically. I need to undertake a sort of a practice of sort of public sociology. Never expecting anyone to agree with you, but just put it out there to try and get people thinking in different, or facilitate people to be open to different types of thinking, and it's not about agreement. I'm an old-fashioned centrist liberal. I don't like totalitarians of the left or of the right. I think we should be having a good discussion the whole time. So I'm on LinkedIn. Also, I've done quite a bit of writing, and I try to do more on a site called Plain Sight, plainsight.co.nz, where I try to do some writing about various ideas that I just think could be interesting or important, or just I feel like writing about something like that. Try for the non-university audience, because the most important people in this country are those outside of the universities. Because if we just think that the most important thinking occurs in universities, well, we're not even very good at talking with each other in the university. So I'd rather engage with people outside universities than within them. So
Yeah,
that's
that's
where I
awesome.
am.
So
And
awesome.
there's some good writing on there, a wide variety. Dane Giroux, who's the main man behind that, he's a great man, and a great man for thinking and writing and trying to do things in a different way as well.
That's
So
awesome.
a big shout out to Dane as well.
Great
He'd be a
stuff.
good guy for you to have a talk to
Yeah.
sometime.
Okay. No, thank you for that. Thanks for that recommendation. That's good. Awesome, Mike. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks again.
Oh, that's good. It's been a good break from marking.
That's good. You're welcome then.
I'd rather talk than mark, so that's okay.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, have a good weekend.
You too, Darcy.
Cheers. All right. See ya.
Thank you.